He took everything from me after 4 decades together, moved his secretary into our home while I was still packing my belongings, and told me I should be grateful he was letting me take my clothes. What he didn't know was that I had kept every financial document, every receipt, every proof of payment for 40 years. He thought I was just the quiet wife who handled the bills and stayed in the background. He was about to learn that quiet doesn't mean powerless, and I was going to teach him that lesson using his own signature against him. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Now, let me tell you exactly how this all started and why the sound of a washing machine will forever remind me of the day I decided to stop being a victim. My name is Margaret Chen, but everyone calls me Maggie. I'm 62 years old, and until 6 months ago, I thought I knew exactly what my life was going to look like for the next 20 years. I thought I'd be spending my retirement traveling with Bob, my husband of 40 years, maybe finally learning to paint watercolors like I'd always wanted, perhaps spoiling grandchildren if Michael ever settled down. I thought we'd grow old together, in the house on Maple Street that we'd called home for 35 years, the one with the rose garden I'd spent decades perfecting, and the kitchen where I'd made thousands of meals for a family that I believed would always be mine. I was wrong about everything. It started on a Tuesday morning in March. I remember because it was the day after our 40th wedding anniversary, and I was still feeling warm from the quiet dinner we'd shared at Crossroads Diner. Nothing fancy, just the booth in the back where we used to sit when we were dating, sharing a piece of their famous apple pie like we had since we were kids. Bob had held my hand across the table and told me how grateful he was for all the years, how he couldn't imagine life without me. 24 hours later, he was asking me to sign divorce papers. I was loading the washing machine when he walked into the laundry room with a manila envelope. The washing machine, that old Whirlpool we'd bought when Michael was still in high school, had been making this grinding noise for weeks. I kept meaning to call a repair service, but between my job at Valley Community Bank and trying to keep up with everything at home, it just kept getting pushed to the bottom of my endless to-do list. The irony isn't lost on me now that it was a broken washing machine that would later become the backdrop for the conversation that would change everything. Bob stood in the doorway, still wearing his hospital scrubs from his shift at Riverside General. He'd been an equipment technician there for almost 20 years, the kind of steady job that paid the bills and came with decent insurance. We'd never been rich, but we'd been comfortable, secure. I thought we were happy. He cleared his throat in that way he did when he was nervous, the same sound he'd made 41 years ago when he'd asked me to marry him in his parents' backyard. But this time, the nervousness wasn't about beginning something beautiful. It was about ending something I thought was permanent. "Maggie," he said, and I could hear something different in his voice. Distant. Like he was talking to a coworker instead of the woman who'd shared his bed for 4 decades. "We need to talk." I turned from the washing machine, a damp towel still, in my hands and saw the envelope. Legal-sized, cream-colored, with the kind of weight that suggested official documents. My stomach dropped before my brain could even process what I was looking at. "What's that?" I asked, though I think I already knew. He held it out to me like it was contaminated. "Divorce papers." The words hung in the air between us like smoke. I stared at the envelope, then at his face, waiting for him to laugh or tell me it was some kind of terrible joke. But his expression was set, determined, like he'd been practicing this moment in the mirror. "Divorce papers," I repeated slowly, testing how the words felt in my mouth. They tasted bitter, foreign. "I've been thinking about this for a long time," he said, and I noticed he wouldn't meet my eyes. "We've grown apart, Maggie. We want different things now." Different things. As if wanting to spend our golden years together was somehow unreasonable. As if the life we'd built, the home we'd created, the history we'd shared was just a difference of opinion. I set the towel down on top of the washing machine, my hands suddenly unsteady. What different things, Bob? What exactly do you want that I don't? That's when he finally looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes that I'd never seen before. Not anger, not sadness, but something worse. Pity. He looked at me like I was a problem he'd finally figured out how to solve. I want to feel alive. Again, he said. I want passion, excitement. I want to wake up every morning and feel like there's still adventure ahead of me instead of just our routine. Routine. 40 years of marriage, and he was calling it routine. The morning coffee I made him every single day, black with 1 sugar, the way he liked it. The shirts I ironed every Sunday so he'd look professional at work. The birthday. Parties I organized. The holiday meals I cooked. The way I'd held his hand through his father's funeral and his mother's long illness. All of it, apparently, was just routine. And you think divorce is going to give you adventure? I asked. He shifted uncomfortably, and that's when I knew there was more to this story. Men like Bob, men who'd been married for 40 years and worked steady jobs and lived in the same house for decades, they don't just wake up one morning craving adventure. Someone puts that idea in their head. There's someone else, I said. It wasn't a question. His silence was all the confirmation I needed. Who is she? It doesn't matter who. It matters to me. My voice was steady, but inside I felt like I was falling through space. Who is she, Bob? He ran a hand through. His graying hair, a gesture I'd seen him make thousands of times when he was stressed. Her name is Jessica. She works in the marketing department at the hospital. Jessica. Young enough to still believe in adventure, I was sure. Young enough to see a stable man with a steady paycheck and a house on Maple Street as a prize worth winning. Young enough to not understand that what she was calling passion was just the thrill of taking something that belonged to someone else. How long? I asked. 6 months. 6 months. While I was planning our anniversary dinner, while I was buying him new ties for Christmas, while I was researching retirement communities we might like, he was falling in love with someone else. 6 months of lies, of coming home to me every night and pretending to be the man I married while secretly building a life with another woman. She's pregnant, he said quietly. The bottom fell out of my world. Pregnant. At 64, Bob was going to be a father again, with someone who wasn't me, someone who could give him something I couldn't, something I'd never been able to give. Him, even when we were young. Michael had been our miracle baby, born after years of trying and hoping and doctors telling us it might never happen. He was 28 now, living in San Diego with a career in tech and a girlfriend he'd been with for 3 years. I'd always hoped he'd give us grandchildren someday, but I'd stopped expecting it. I'd made my peace with the idea that our family was complete as it was. Apparently, Bob hadn't. Congratulations, I said, and I was surprised by how calm my voice sounded. When's the baby due? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. October. 7 months away. 7 months to demolish 40 years of marriage and build something new with someone else. 7 months to turn me from a wife into an ex-wife, from a partner into an obstacle. What do you want from me? I asked. He held out the envelope again. I want you to sign these. I've been fair, Maggie. You can have half of everything we've saved, half the retirement accounts. I'll keep the house since you'll probably want something smaller anyway, easier to maintain. He'd keep the house I'd found, the house I'd insisted we buy even when he thought it was too expensive, the house where I'd planted every flower in the garden, where I'd painted every room, where I'd raised our son and nursed his parents and created a lifetime of memories. He was going to keep it and move his pregnant girlfriend into the bedroom where I'd slept for 35 years. Just like that? I asked. Just like that. He was already backing toward the door, eager to escape this conversation now that he'd delivered his bomb. My lawyer says if we both agree to the terms, we can have everything finalized in 60 days. 60 days. 40 years of marriage ended in 2 months. I looked down at the envelope in my hands. Legal documents that would turn me from Margaret Chen Williams back to just Margaret Chen. Papers that would divide our life into neat categories: his, mine, and nothing in between. I'll need time to read through all this, I said. Of course. Take your time. He was already at the door. I'll be staying at Jessica's place for a while, give you some space to process everything. He'd be staying at Jessica's place, not at a hotel, not at his brother's house, but with her. The woman who was carrying his child, who was young enough to believe in forever, who probably had no idea she was just the latest in a long line of midlife crisis cliches. "Bob," I called out as he was leaving. He turned back, and for a moment I thought I saw a flicker of the man I'd married. The young technician who'd been so nervous asking me out that he'd dropped his keys 3 times. The man who'd held my hand during my mother's funeral and promised me we'd face everything together. Was any of it real? I asked. The 40 years? Our anniversary dinner yesterday, any of it? He was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was softer than it had been all morning. It was real, Maggie. It just wasn't enough. After he left, I sat alone in the laundry room, surrounded by half-folded towels and the sound of that broken washing machine struggling through its cycle. I stared at the divorce papers until the words blurred together, until the legal language became just noise on expensive paper. 40 years. 2/3 of my life spent building something I thought was permanent. I'd given up career opportunities to support his dreams. I'd moved across the country when he got a better job offer. I'd been the one to handle all the finances, all the paperwork, all the details that kept our life running smoothly while he focused on work and hobbies, and apparently, for the last 6 months, on Jessica. I thought about calling my son, but what would I say? Your father has left me for a pregnant woman half my age? Your parents' marriage was apparently just routine that he got tired of? I thought about calling my sister in Phoenix, but she'd just tell me she'd never trusted Bob anyway, which wouldn't help anything. Instead, I did what I'd always done when life overwhelmed me. I cleaned. I finished the laundry, folded every towel, with precise corners, organized the linen closet. I vacuumed the living room, dusted the furniture, wiped down the kitchen counters until they gleamed. I kept my hands busy so my mind wouldn't have time to fully process what had just happened. It wasn't until I was scrubbing the bathroom that I finally broke down. Standing in the shower we'd shared for 35 years, surrounded by his shampoo and his razor and all the little evidence of a shared life, I started crying. Not the elegant tears you see in movies, but ugly, body-shaking sobs that left me gasping for air. I cried for the future I'd thought we'd have. I cried for the grandchildren I'd imagined spoiling. I cried for the woman I'd been that morning, the one who'd thought her biggest problem was a noisy washing machine. I cried for 40 years of trusting someone who'd been planning his escape for months. But mostly, I cried because I finally understood what he meant when he said I wasn't enough. I wasn't young enough, exciting enough, fertile enough. I was just Margaret, the woman who paid the bills and made the coffee and kept the house running while he decided what he really wanted from life. When the tears finally stopped, I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror. Red eyes, gray hair that needed a touch-up, lines around my mouth from 4 decades of smiling at his jokes. I looked like exactly what I was, a 62-year-old woman whose husband had traded her in for a newer model. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with the divorce papers spread out in front of me, reading every word. Bob's lawyer had been thorough, I'd give him that. The division of assets was laid out in precise detail. He would keep the house, worth about $450,000 according to the recent appraisal. I would get half of our retirement savings, about $200,000. plus half of our checking and savings accounts. He'd pay me alimony for 5 years, a modest amount that would keep me afloat, but certainly wouldn't make me rich. It was fair, I suppose, in the cold mathematical way that lawyers think about fairness. But there was nothing fair about the fact that he got to keep the home I'd created while I had to start over at 62. Nothing fair about the fact that he got a new family while I got loneliness and a smaller apartment somewhere else. I was still reading when the washing machine finally gave up completely. The grinding noise I'd been ignoring for weeks turned into a loud bang, followed by silence. I walked back to the laundry room and found water spreading across the floor, the machine dead and leaking. Perfect. Just perfect. My marriage was over, my future was uncertain, and now my washing machine was flooding the house. I called an emergency repair service and was told they could have someone out the next morning. The technician would be David Thompson, they said, and he specialized in older machines. He'd know what to do. As I mopped up the water with towels that would now need to be washed somewhere else, I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. 40 years of marriage ended with divorce papers and a broken washing machine. If this was adventure, I thought Bob was welcome to it. I had no idea that the repair visit the next morning would be the beginning of everything changing. That David Thompson would turn out to be more than just a technician, and that fixing my washing machine would be the least important thing he'd do for me. Sometimes the most important conversations happen in the most ordinary places. Sometimes salvation comes disguised as a service call. And sometimes when you think your story is ending, it's really just beginning. David Thompson arrived at 8:30 sharp the next morning, carrying a toolbox that looked older than some of the appliances he probably fixed. He was maybe 55, with graying temples and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. The kind of man who looked like he'd seen enough broken things in his life to understand that not everything could be fixed. But that didn't stop him from trying. I led him to the laundry room where my Whirlpool sat silent and defeated, surrounded by damp towels I'd used to soak up the flood. The morning light streaming through the small window made the whole scene look even more pathetic than it had the night before. "Well," David said, crouching down to examine the machine. "She's definitely seen better days. How long have you had her?" "About 15 years, I said, wrapping my robe tighter around myself. I'd barely slept, and I probably looked as broken as my washing machine. She started making that grinding noise about 3 weeks ago, but I kept putting off calling for repairs." David nodded, running his hands along the sides of the machine, with the practiced touch of someone who'd diagnosed 1,000 mechanical ailments. "That's usually when they're trying to tell you something important. These older Whirlpools, they're built to last, but when they start talking to you, it's best to listen." He opened his toolbox and pulled out a small flashlight, peering into the gaps around the drum. "Mind if I ask what happened here? Looks like she gave up pretty dramatically." "Yesterday was a difficult day," I said, which felt like the understatement of the century. Everything seemed to break down at once. David glanced up at me, and something in his expression shifted. He'd probably seen enough crying women standing over broken appliances to recognize the signs of a life falling apart. "I'm sorry to hear that. Sometimes it feels like when one thing goes wrong, everything else decides to follow suit." I found myself nodding, surprised by how much comfort I took from this stranger's simple acknowledgement. Bob had always been impatient with what he called my emotional reactions to problems. His solution to everything was to either fix it immediately or replace it and move on. He'd never understood that sometimes you needed a moment to grieve, even for something as simple as a broken washing machine. "Can you save her?" I asked. David was quiet for a moment, his flashlight illuminating the machine's interior. "The drum bearing is shot," he said finally. "The seal's blown, and there's some damage to the transmission. Technically, yes, I can fix her, but the parts alone are going to run you about $400 plus labor. For a machine this age, you might be better off investing in something new." $400. A week ago, that would have been an annoyance, but not a crisis. Today, staring at divorce papers that would cut my income in half, it felt like a mountain I couldn't climb. "I see," I said quietly. David must have heard something in my voice because he stood up and really looked at me for the first time. Not just the polite assessment of a customer, but the kind of look that actually sees a person. "You know what?" he said. "Let me take a closer look at a few things before we make any decisions. Sometimes these old machines have more fight left in them than we think." He went back to work, removing panels and testing connections with a methodical patience that was somehow soothing to watch. I found myself lingering in the doorway instead of leaving him to work in peace. There was something comforting about watching someone approach a problem with calm competence, treating my broken washing machine like it deserved care and attention. "You live here alone?" David asked as he worked, his voice casual but kind. "As of yesterday, yes," I said before I could stop myself. His hands paused for just a moment before continuing their examination. "That's a big change. 40 years of marriage, ended with divorce papers in a manila envelope?" The words spilled out before I could stop them, and I immediately felt foolish for oversharing with a complete stranger. "I'm sorry. You don't need to hear about my problems. You're here to fix a washing machine, not listen to a woman have a breakdown." David set down his wrench and turned to face me fully. "Mrs. Chen, I've been fixing appliances for 30 years. You'd be amazed how often a broken washing machine is really about something much bigger. And for what it's worth, I've got nowhere else to be this morning, so if you need to talk while I work, that's perfectly fine with me." Something about his matter-of-fact kindness broke through the careful composure I'd been maintaining since Bob walked out. I found myself telling him everything about the anniversary dinner on Monday night, about Bob's speech about routine and adventure, about Jessica and the pregnancy and the house I was going to lose. David listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding or making sympathetic sounds, as he continued working on the machine. He didn't offer platitudes or advice, didn't try to fix me the way he was fixing my Whirlpool. He just listened, and somehow that was exactly what I needed. "So he gets to keep the house," I concluded, feeling lighter just for having said it all out loud. "The house I found, the house I've maintained, the house where I've lived for 35 years. But his lawyer says it's fair because he's paying alimony." David was quiet for a long moment, testing something with a multimeter. "Can I ask you something, Mrs. Chen? And feel free to tell me it's none of my business." "At this point, I think I've told you enough that nothing's off limits. Who's been handling the finances in your marriage? The bills, the mortgage payments, that kind of thing?" "Me," I said immediately. "I've always been better with numbers, and Bob's work schedule is unpredictable. I've been managing everything financial for our entire marriage, including the house payments. Every single one. I set up the automatic transfers, I balanced the checkbooks, I filed the taxes. Bob always said he was grateful he didn't have to think about any of that stuff." David nodded slowly, and I could see him processing something. "And your name is on the deed?" "Of course, we bought it together." "What about refinancing? Have you ever refinanced the mortgage?" I thought about it. Once, about 10 years ago when rates dropped. Bob said it was too much paperwork and he didn't want to deal with it, so I handled everything. Signed all the documents, worked with the bank, coordinated the whole process. David had stopped working entirely now, his full attention on our conversation. "Mrs. Chen, I'm not a lawyer, but I've been through a divorce myself. A pretty ugly one, actually. And what you're describing sounds like you might have more leverage than you think." "What do you mean?" "Well, if you've been the one making all the payments, if your name is on the deed, if you handled the refinancing yourself, then you're not just some dependent spouse he's graciously allowing to take half. You're a full partner in that property. Maybe more than a partner depending on what the documentation shows." I stared at him, something stirring in my chest that felt almost like hope. But his lawyer already drew up the papers. It's all decided. His lawyer drew up papers that benefit his client, David said gently. That doesn't mean those papers represent the only possible outcome. Have you consulted with your own attorney? I haven't consulted with anyone. I just assumed. I trailed off, realizing how naive I sounded. I assumed that because Bob initiated the divorce, he got to set the terms. David smiled, the first real smile I'd seen since this nightmare began. Mrs. Chen, whoever told you that was lying to you. Probably your husband's lawyer, who's hoping you're too overwhelmed to get proper representation. The washing machine suddenly hummed to life, startling both of us. David had apparently found and fixed whatever was keeping it from running, though I'd been so absorbed in our conversation that I'd missed exactly what he'd done. How did you fix it so fast? I asked. Sometimes the problem isn't as big as it first appears, he said, closing up his toolbox. Your drum bearing is fine. The seal just needed to be cleaned and repositioned. The noise you were hearing was a small piece of debris that got caught in the drain pump. $20 fix, not $400. I felt tears welling up again, but these were different from the night before. These were tears of relief, of gratitude, of something that might have been the first glimpse of possibility I'd felt since Bob handed me those papers. How much do I owe you? $20 for the part, $60 for the service call. But Mrs. Chen, before I go, I want to give you something. He pulled a business card from his shirt pocket, but instead of his repair service information, it had a woman's name and phone number written on the back. This is Patricia Rodriguez. She's an attorney, specializes in family law. She helped me when my ex-wife tried to claim she deserved everything because she'd been a stay-at-home mom, even though I'd been the one paying for the house the whole time. I can't afford a lawyer right now, I said automatically. Most family law attorneys will do a consultation for free, especially if they think you have a strong case. And Mrs. Chen, based on what you've told me, I think you might have a very strong case. I took the card, running my fingers over the embossed lettering. Patricia Rodriguez, attorney at law. What if she can't help? What if Bob's lawyer is right, and this is just how divorce works? Then you're no worse off than you are right now, David said, shouldering his toolbox. But what if I'm right? What if you've been underestimating your own power this whole time? After he left, I sat at my kitchen table staring at Patricia Rodriguez's business card. The washing machine was humming quietly in the background, working perfectly for the first time in weeks. David had been right about the machine having more fight left than anyone expected. I wondered if he might be right about me too. I thought about the 40 years of mortgage payments I'd made, transferred automatically from our joint account, but managed entirely by me. I thought about the refinancing paperwork, all the documents I'd signed and filed and organized while Bob was at work or watching television or playing golf. I thought about the tax returns where I'd claimed the mortgage interest deduction, the homeowner's insurance policies I'd researched and purchased, the property tax appeals I'd filed when I thought our assessment was too high. For 40 years, I'd been the one taking care of our home, financially and practically. Bob had lived there, slept there, eaten meals I'd cooked in the kitchen, and watched television in the living room I'd decorated. But I'd been the one who'd made it possible. I'd been the one who'd turned a house into our home. And now he wanted to give it to Jessica, the pregnant girlfriend who'd never made a single payment, never filed a single insurance claim, never stayed up late worrying about interest rates or property values. He wanted to hand her the life I'd built and tell me I should be grateful for whatever scraps his lawyer decided I deserved. I picked up the phone and dialed Patricia Rodriguez's number before I could talk myself out of it. Rodriguez Law Office. This is Patricia. Ms. Rodriguez, my name is Margaret Chen. I got your number from David Thompson. He said you might be able to help me with a divorce situation. David's a good man, she said warmly. I'd be happy to talk with you. When Can you come in? How about today? There was a pause, and I could hear her flipping through what sounded like an appointment book. I have an opening at 2 o'clock if you can make it on short notice. I'll be there. Patricia Rodriguez's office was in a small professional building downtown, the kind of place that felt serious but not intimidating. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe 45, with short dark hair and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she didn't waste time on small talk. "Tell me about your situation," she said after we'd settled in her office. I went through the whole story again, starting with Monday night's anniversary dinner and ending with that morning's revelation about my role in managing our finances. Patricia took notes on a legal pad, occasionally asking clarifying questions about dates and documentation. "How long have you been employed at the bank?" she asked. 22 years. I started as a teller and worked my way up to supervisor in the commercial lending department. "So you understand financial documents, loan processes, that sort of thing?" "It's what I do for a living," Patricia smiled. "And you've been managing all the household finances for how long?" "The entire marriage. Bob always said he was terrible with money, that he was lucky to have me to handle all that complicated stuff. But he's perfectly comfortable signing papers that give him sole ownership of a house you've been paying for." "Apparently." Patricia set down her pen and leaned back in her chair. "Margaret, I'm going to be very direct with you. Your husband's attorney is counting on you being too overwhelmed or too intimidated to challenge their proposed settlement. They're hoping you'll sign those papers without getting proper representation because you think you don't have any other choice. Don't I?" "Not even close. Based on what you've told me, you have several strong arguments for why you should receive significantly more than 50% of the marital assets, particularly the house. You've been the one managing the property, making the payments, handling all the administrative work. In many jurisdictions, that kind of contribution can be grounds for a larger share of the asset." I felt something loosen in my chest, a knot I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. "So, I don't have to just accept what Bob's lawyer decided?" "Absolutely not. In fact, I'd recommend we file our own petition, outlining exactly what we think you're entitled to. Let them respond to us, for a change." "What would that look like?" Patricia pulled out a fresh legal pad and started sketching out possibilities. "Well, given your contribution to the household finances and your professional background in banking, we could argue that you should receive the house plus a portion of the retirement assets. We could also argue for increased alimony based on the disparity in your post-divorce earning potential. Bob makes almost twice what I do." "Exactly. He's 64 and established in his career. You're 62 and likely to face age discrimination in the job market. That's a significant factor in determining alimony." I thought about Jessica, 28 and pregnant, probably planning what color to paint the bedroom I'd shared with Bob for 35 years. Planning a nursery in the room where I'd dreamed of having more children, where I'd grieved every month when those dreams didn't come true. What are the chances we could actually get the house? Patricia was quiet for a moment, considering. "Based on what you've told me about your financial contributions and the documentation you have, I'd say we have a very good chance, especially if we can demonstrate that your husband's adultery and the circumstances of his relationship with this other woman represent a violation of his fiduciary duty to the marriage." "Fiduciary duty? How long before Bob finds out?" "His lawyer has probably called him already. These aren't the kind of accusations attorneys like to sit on." I hung up the phone and walked through my house, really looking at it for the first time in weeks. The hardwood floors I'd refinished myself when we first moved in. The kitchen I'd renovated 3 years ago, choosing every tile and cabinet pull. The garden visible through the window, where I'd spent countless hours planting and weeding and creating something beautiful. This wasn't just a house worth $450,000. This was the physical manifestation of 40 years of my life, 40 years of choices and dreams and careful tending. Bob wanted to sign it over to a woman who'd never pulled a weed in the garden or stayed up all night with a sick child in the upstairs bedroom or refinanced the mortgage when interest rates dropped. My phone rang at 7:15. Bob's name appeared on the caller ID, and for a moment I considered not answering. But I wanted to hear his voice when he realized I wasn't the pushover his lawyer had assumed I would be. "Maggie, what the hell is this?" His voice was tight with anger, no trace of the guilty politeness he'd shown when he'd served me with divorce papers. "It's my response to your petition," I said calmly. "I thought you'd appreciate my attention to detail." $15,000? You're claiming I spent $15,000 on Jessica? "I'm not claiming anything, Bob. I'm documenting what you actually spent. The credit card statements don't lie. Those were business expenses, work dinners, conferences. Chez Laurent isn't a business dinner spot, and Tiffany & Co. doesn't sell conference materials." I was surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "I have 40 years of our financial records, Bob. I know the difference between your actual business expenses and your affair expenses." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When he spoke again, his voice was different. Less angry, more worried. "Maggie, this is getting out of hand. We can work this out between ourselves. We don't need to drag lawyers into every detail of our private life." "You dragged lawyers into our private life when you filed for divorce. I'm just making sure they have accurate information. Look, maybe I wasn't as careful as I should have been about keeping my personal life separate from our joint accounts. But that doesn't mean I owe you the house and 70% of our retirement money. Actually, Bob, it might mean exactly that." Another long silence. "What do you want, Maggie? Really? What's this going to accomplish except making both of us miserable and making the lawyers rich?" I walked to the kitchen window and looked out at my garden, where the early roses were beginning to bloom. "I want what I've earned. I want recognition for the 40 years I spent building our life while you were deciding whether it was good enough for you. And I want you to understand that there are consequences for treating people like they're disposable." "You're angry. I get that. But destroying me isn't going to make you feel better." "I'm not trying to destroy you, Bob. I'm trying to survive what you already did to me." He tried a different approach, his voice softening into the tone he used to use when he wanted something from me. "Maggie, honey, we have a son together. We have 40 years of history. Don't let hurt feelings turn this into something uglier than it needs to be." "Don't call me honey," I said quietly. "And don't talk to me about our son or our history. You threw all of that away when you decided Jessica was more important than the life we built together." "I never said she was more important. You moved her into our house, Bob. You got her pregnant while you were still married to me. You spent our money on her for months while telling me we needed to be more careful about expenses. What exactly would you call that?" The silence stretched between us until I wondered if he'd hung up. Finally, he spoke again, and all the fight had gone out of his voice. "What's it going to take to make this go away?" "It's not going to go away. This is my life, Bob. This is what you reduced me to when you decided I wasn't worth being honest with." After I hung up, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on my back porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I was fighting back instead of just enduring. Bob was worried, his lawyer was scrambling, and Jessica was probably getting her first taste of what it felt like to be with a man whose life was complicated by the woman he'd left behind. Patricia called the next morning with an update. "Bob's attorney wants to schedule a meeting. They're ready to discuss revised terms." "Already?" The financial infidelity documentation spooked them. They know that kind of evidence plays very badly in front of a judge, especially when the wronged spouse has your professional credibility. We met at Patricia's office the following Tuesday. Bob's lawyer, a thin man in an expensive suit who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, spread his own documents across the conference table with the air of someone making a generous concession. My client is prepared to offer Mrs. Chen 65% of the marital assets, including the house, in exchange for a commitment that the allegations of financial impropriety will not be pursued in court. Patricia didn't even look at the papers. That's not an offer, that's an insult. Your client spent $15,000 of community property on his affair, violated his fiduciary duties to the marriage, and you think he gets to negotiate from a position of strength? The alleged financial irregularities can be explained. Can they? Patricia slid a folder across the table. Because we've done some additional research since we filed our petition. Hotel charges in cities where your client claimed to be attending conferences, but no corresponding conference registrations or business deductions on the tax returns Mrs. Chen prepared. Restaurant charges for 2 people during times when he told his wife he was working late. A very clear pattern of deception that goes back much further than the 6 months he's admitted to. I watched Bob's lawyer flip through our additional documentation, his expression growing grimmer with each page. We'd spent the weekend expanding our timeline, and the evidence of Bob's deception stretched back almost a year. He'd been planning his escape much longer than I'd realized, using our money to finance not just his affair with Jessica, but a whole secret life I'd known nothing about. My client acknowledges that mistakes were made, the lawyer said finally. But Mrs. Chen's demands are punitive, not equitable. Your client committed adultery using community funds to support his affair partner, Patricia replied. Mrs. Chen's demands are exactly what the law allows in cases of financial infidelity. The meeting ended with no agreement, but I could see that Bob's position was weaker than anyone had anticipated. His lawyer requested additional time to review our evidence and consult with his client about next steps. They're scared, Patricia told me as we walked to our cars after the meeting. That request for additional time means they're trying to figure out how to minimize the damage, not how to fight our claims. Good, I said, and I was surprised by how much I meant it. 2 weeks later, Patricia called with news that Bob's attorney wanted to schedule another meeting. When you're married, you have a legal obligation to act in the best interests of the marital partnership. Having an affair with a colleague, getting her pregnant, and then trying to transfer marital assets to benefit his new relationship, that's a pretty clear violation of that duty. For the first time since Bob had handed me those papers, I felt something that might have been anger. Not just hurt or sadness or confusion, but genuine anger at the injustice of it all. He'd broken our marriage vows, lied to me for months, and then had the audacity to tell me I should be grateful for whatever his lawyer decided I deserved. How long would this take? It depends on how reasonable they want to be once they realize you're not going to roll over. If they fight us, it could take 6 months to a year. If they're smart, they'll try to negotiate once they see our petition. And your fees? I work on a sliding scale for cases like this. We can discuss payment arrangements, but Margaret, I want you to understand something. If we're successful in getting you a larger share of the assets, my fees will more than pay for themselves. And if we're not successful, we'll work something out. I looked around her office at the law books and diplomas and the photo of what looked like Patricia with her own family. This woman didn't know me, had no reason to care about my 40-year marriage or my broken heart or my fear of starting over at 62. But she was offering to fight for me anyway. What do I need to do? First, don't sign anything your husband's lawyer sends you. Second, gather every financial document you can find. Bank statements, tax returns, property records, mortgage documents, everything. Third, try to document as much as you can about your contributions to the household and your husband's affair. Document the affair? Dates, if you know them. Any evidence of money being spent on her. Any communications you might have saved. We want to build a clear picture of how his relationship with this woman affected the marital assets and his obligations to you. I thought about Bob's credit. Card statements, which I'd been paying and filing for 40 years. I thought about the business trips that had seemed more frequent lately, the dinners out that he'd explained as work functions, the gifts that had appeared on our statements that I'd never received. I think I can find quite a bit of documentation. Patricia smiled. I'm sure you can. You've been managing finances for 22 years at a bank and 40 years in your marriage. I bet you're very good at keeping records. As I drove home from Patricia's office, I felt more energized than I had in months, not just because of the possibility of keeping my house, but because for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I had some control over what happened next. I wasn't just a victim of Bob's midlife crisis and his lawyer's paperwork. I was Margaret Chen, commercial lending supervisor, financial manager, and apparently, a woman with options. That night, I spread 40 years of financial records across my dining room table. Bank statements, tax returns, mortgage documents, credit card statements, investment account summaries, insurance policies. The paper trail of a life built together, documented in my careful handwriting and meticulous filing system. As I worked through the documents, patterns began to emerge that I'd never noticed before. Business dinners that were always for two. People but never included me. Hotel charges in cities where Bob had supposedly been attending conferences alone. Jewelry purchases that had never materialized as gifts for me. In the most recent credit card statements, the pattern was even clearer. Expensive dinners, flowers, a weekend getaway to Napa Valley that Bob had told me was a work retreat. He'd been spending our money on Jessica for months, using the credit card I managed and paid off every month to finance his affair. I made careful notes on everything, organizing it chronologically, and cross-referencing charges with Bob's work schedule and travel calendar. By the time I finished, I had a clear timeline of his relationship with Jessica, documented in charges to our joint accounts. It was after midnight when I finally closed the last file folder. My dining room looked like a financial crime scene, covered in evidence of deception and betrayal. But for the first time since Bob had handed me those divorce papers, I didn't feel powerless. I felt dangerous. Tomorrow I would call Patricia and schedule another appointment. We would file our own petition, laying out exactly what I thought I deserved after 40 years of marriage to a man who'd spent 6 months planning his escape while I paid his bills and managed his life. Bob thought he was getting adventure with Jessica. He was about to learn that I could be pretty adventurous myself when someone tried to steal the life I'd spent 40 years building. The washing machine hummed quietly in the background, working perfectly thanks to David Thompson's patient diagnosis and careful repair. Just like my marriage, it had needed more than a surface-level fix. But unlike my marriage, my washing machine was worth saving. I was about to find out if I was worth fighting for. I walked into Patricia's office 3 days later carrying 2 banker's boxes full of documents and a determination I hadn't felt in decades. The evidence of Bob's deception was overwhelming once I'd laid it all out systematically. Credit card. Charges for romantic dinners, hotel rooms, jewelry, flowers, even prenatal vitamins charged to our joint account in March. He'd been using our money to court another woman and prepare for their child while telling me we needed to tighten our budget. Patricia whistled low as I spread the documentation across her conference table. Margaret, this is extraordinary. I've seen people try to hide assets during divorce proceedings, but I've rarely seen someone be this blatant about using marital funds to support an affair. He never thought I'd check, I said, organizing the credit card statements by date. For 40 years, I've been the one paying these bills, but he assumed I was just going through the motions. He didn't realize I actually read every line item. Well, his oversight is about to become very expensive for him. Patricia picked up a statement from February showing a charge for $500 at a jewelry store. Do you remember receiving any jewelry from your husband in February? My birthday is in February. He gave me a card and said we should skip gifts this year because money was tight. I pointed to another charge on the same statement. That same week, he spent $300 on dinner at Chez Laurent, the most expensive restaurant in town. When I asked him about working, late that night, he said he'd grabbed a sandwich from the hospital cafeteria. Patricia was taking notes as fast as I could speak. How much total would you estimate he spent on this relationship using marital funds? I'd already calculated that figure during my sleepless night of document review. Conservative estimate. Based on what I can directly trace, about $15,000 over the past 8 months. $15,000 of community property spent on adultery. Patricia looked up from her notes with something that might have been admiration. Margaret, your husband's attorney is going to have a very bad day when we file our response. What exactly are we going to ask for? Patricia pulled out a fresh legal pad and started sketching out our strategy. Given the evidence of financial infidelity, your documented contributions to the household, and the circumstances of the breakdown of the marriage, I think we should ask for the house, 70% of the retirement assets, increased alimony, and reimbursement for the marital funds he spent on his affair. You think we can get all that? I think we can get most of it. The financial infidelity alone is grounds for a disproportionate asset division in your favor. Add in your role as the financial manager of the household and your professional expertise, and we have a very compelling case. That afternoon, Patricia drafted our counterpetition while I sat in her office double-checking figures and dates. The document was 15 pages of carefully crafted legal language that painted a picture of my marriage very different from the one Bob's attorney had presented. Instead of a mutual decision between equal partners, it described a situation where a financially sophisticated spouse had been betrayed by a husband who'd violated his fiduciary duties to the marriage. I want to file this today, Patricia said as she printed the final version. Strike while we have momentum and before they have time to prepare a defense for these financial irregularities. Won't they try to negotiate first? They might. But I want them to see exactly what we're prepared to argue in court before they make any settlement offers. Sometimes the threat of public disclosure is more powerful than actual litigation. The papers were filed at 4:30 that afternoon. Patricia called me at home an hour later to let me know that Bob's attorney had been officially served and would have 30 days to respond to our petition. This time, they were prepared to discuss the house. They're offering you the house plus 50% of the retirement assets, Patricia told me over the phone. It's not everything we asked for, but it's significantly better than their original offer. What about reimbursement for the money he spent on Jessica? They're claiming those were legitimate business expenses and personal purchases that don't constitute financial infidelity. I thought about the jewelry I'd never received, the dinners at restaurants I'd never been to, the hotel rooms for romantic getaways I'd never taken. Do we have a strong enough case to get more if we go to court? I think so. But going to court means months more of this process, significant legal fees, and no guarantee of outcome. It's your decision, Margaret. I asked for time to think about it, but I already knew what I wanted to do. The house was what mattered most to me. Not just the financial value, but the principle of it. Bob wouldn't get to hand over the home I'd built to his pregnant girlfriend. He wouldn't get to erase 40 years of my life that easily. I want the house, I told Patricia when I called her back. But I also want them to admit wrongdoing. I wanted in writing that Bob violated his duties to our marriage by using community funds to support his affair. That's going to be harder to get. Admissions of wrongdoing in divorce settlements are rare because they can affect other legal matters. Then we go to court. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Margaret, are you sure? This could get very ugly, very public. Your husband's affair will be a matter of court record. Your son will have to live with the details being public. Is it worth that risk for an admission that won't change the financial outcome? I thought about Michael, my son who'd tried so hard to stay neutral, who'd been hurt by his father's betrayal, but still hoped for some kind of family reconciliation. I thought about the humiliation of having my private pain become public record. I thought about the legal fees and the stress, and the months more of having my life in limbo. Then I thought about Jessica, probably already planning how to redecorate my bedroom, maybe registering for baby gifts at stores where I'd shopped for 40 years. I thought about Bob, who'd spent months lying to my face while using our money to build a life with another woman. I thought about 40 years of being the responsible one, the careful one, the one who always put family harmony ahead of her own needs. Yes, I said, it's worth it. The trial was scheduled for August, giving both sides 3 months to prepare their cases. Patricia warned me that Bob's attorney would try to paint me as a vindictive ex-wife who couldn't accept that her marriage was over. They would argue that I was using the legal system to punish my husband for falling in love with someone else. Let them, I said. But they'll have to explain why he fell in love using our joint credit card. As summer progressed, I threw myself into preparing for trial with the same methodical attention I'd always applied to everything in my life. I organized evidence, reviewed financial records, prepared timelines, and documentation. Patricia was impressed by my thoroughness, but she warned me that testifying about my marriage in court would be emotionally difficult. They're going to ask you personal questions about your relationship with Bob, about your sex life, about whether you suspected the affair. They're going to try to make you seem naive or willfully blind to what was happening. Let them try, I said. I kept records of everything, Patricia. Everything. If they want to claim I should have known what was happening, I can show them exactly when every suspicious charge appeared and how Bob explained each one. The week before trial, Bob made one last attempt to settle. He called me directly, bypassing our lawyers, his voice heavy with exhaustion. Maggie, please. This is killing both of us. Jessica's due in 6 weeks, and this stress isn't good for the baby. Can't we just end this? You could have ended it months ago by being honest about what you'd done, I said. You chose to lie, to cheat, and to steal. Now you get to live with the consequences. I never stole from you. You spent $15,000 of our money on another woman while telling me we couldn't afford a vacation. What would you call that? I made mistakes. I admit that. But destroying me in court isn't going to undo any of it. I'm not trying to undo anything, Bob. I'm trying to get justice for what you did. The night before trial, I couldn't sleep. I walked through my house in the dark, touching furniture I'd chosen, walls I'd painted, fixtures I'd installed. This house held 40 years of memories, good and bad, and tomorrow I would have to defend my right to keep it. I thought about the woman I'd been when Bob and I first bought this house. Young, optimistic, full of dreams about the life we'd build together. I thought about all the ways I'd compromised over the years, all the times I'd put Bob's needs ahead of my own, all the ways I'd made myself smaller so he could feel bigger. That woman would never have taken her husband to court. That woman would have signed whatever papers he put in front of her and tried to rebuild her life around whatever scraps he left behind. But I wasn't that woman anymore. I was 62, years old, financially sophisticated, and tired of being underestimated. Tomorrow, I would walk into court and fight for what I'd earned, what I'd built, what I deserved. Bob had wanted adventure. He was about to get more adventure than he'd bargained for. The courtroom at Pine Valley Court was smaller than I'd expected, with wood paneling that made everything feel serious and permanent. I sat at the plaintiff's table next to Patricia, wearing my best navy suit and the pearl earrings my mother had given me for my wedding day. Across the aisle, Bob sat with his attorney, looking older than I'd ever seen him. His hair was grayer, his face drawn with stress. Jessica was nowhere to be seen, probably at home preparing for a baby that would arrive in the middle of the legal chaos Bob had created. Judge Catherine Morrison was a woman in her 50s with silver hair and sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She reviewed the case files with the kind of methodical attention I recognized from my own work at the bank. This was a woman who understood numbers, documentation, and the importance of getting details right. This is a contested dissolution. of marriage with disputes over property division and spousal support, Judge Morrison said, looking up from the files. I've reviewed both petitions and the supporting documentation. This appears to be a complex case involving allegations of financial misconduct. Are both parties ready to proceed? Patricia stood. Yes, Your Honor. The petitioner is ready. Bob's attorney, Mr. Henley, rose as well. The respondent is ready, Your Honor. Very well. Ms. Rodriguez, you may present your opening statement. Patricia walked to the center of the courtroom with confidence, her voice clear and strong. Your Honor, this case is about more than the dissolution of a 40-year marriage. It's about justice for a woman who dedicated her entire adult life to building a partnership, only to discover that her husband had been systematically betraying that partnership for over a year. She outlined our case methodically. My role as the financial manager of our household, my professional expertise in banking and commercial lending, the extensive documentation of Bob's use of marital funds to support his affair with Jessica Parker, the pattern of deception that extended far beyond the 6 months he'd originally admitted to. Mrs. Chen didn't just contribute to this marriage. Financially, Patricia continued, she was the financial architect of their life together. She found their home, managed the mortgage, handled the refinancing, paid every bill, filed every tax return. While she was doing that work, Mr. Williams was using the credit cards she managed to fund a secret relationship that ultimately produced a child with another woman. Patricia returned to our table, and Mr. Henley took his place at the center of the courtroom. He was younger than Patricia, probably in his 30s, with the kind of aggressive confidence that suggested he thought he could charm his way through any argument. Your Honor, what we have here is a woman who cannot accept that her marriage has ended. Mrs. Chen is attempting to use the legal system to punish her estranged husband for falling in love with someone else. Yes, mistakes were made. Yes, Mr. Williams could have handled the transition out of his marriage more gracefully, but the allegations of financial misconduct are grossly exaggerated and ignore the context of a man trying to navigate an impossible emotional situation. He painted Bob as a victim of his own emotions, a man who'd tried to be honorable but had been overwhelmed by unexpected love. He suggested that my financial documentation was the obsessive record-keeping of a controlling spouse, not evidence of betrayal. Mr. Williams worked for 40 years to build the assets that Mrs. Chen now claims she deserves to control. The fact that she paid the bills doesn't make her the sole owner of everything they built together. The court should not reward vindictive behavior with a punitive asset division. Judge Morrison listened to both opening statements without expression, making notes on a legal pad. When Mr. Henley finished, she looked up and called for the first witness. The court will hear from Mrs. Margaret Chen. I walked to the witness stand on unsteady legs, raising my right hand to swear to tell the truth. Looking out at the courtroom, I could see Bob watching me with an expression I couldn't read. Worry, maybe, or guilt. Possibly just exhaustion from months of legal maneuvering. Patricia approached the witness stand with a gentle smile. Mrs. Chen, please tell the court about your professional background. I described my 22 years at Valley Community Bank, my progression from teller to commercial lending supervisor, my experience reviewing financial documents and assessing creditworthiness. Patricia walked me through my role in managing our household finances, establishing that I hadn't just been paying bills, but actively managing our family's financial strategy. Did you handle the mortgage on your marital home? Every payment for 35 years. I set up the automatic transfers. I managed the escrow account for taxes and insurance. I coordinated the refinancing when interest rates dropped. Did your husband participate in these financial management tasks? No. Bob always said he was grateful he didn't have to think about money matters. He said it was one less thing to worry about. Patricia introduced evidence methodically. Banks. Statements showing automatic mortgage payments from accounts I managed. Tax returns I'd prepared and filed. Insurance policies I'd researched and purchased. A clear paper trail showing that while Bob had lived in our house, I had been the one ensuring we could afford to keep it. Then we moved to the more painful evidence, the credit card statements showing charges I'd never benefited from, the restaurants where Bob had taken Jessica while telling me he was working late, the jewelry purchases that had never materialized as gifts for me. Mrs. Chen, I'm showing you Exhibit C, a credit card statement from March of this year. Can you identify the charge highlighted in yellow? I looked at the statement, though I'd memorized every detail months ago. It's a charge for $647 at Tiffany & Co. Did you receive any jewelry from Tiffany & Co. in March? No. My birthday is in February, and Bob told me we should skip gifts because money was tight. But he spent over $600 at a jewelry store the following month? Yes. Do you know who received that jewelry? Mr. Henley objected. Calls for speculation. Sustained, Judge Morrison said. Patricia moved on to the next exhibit, and the next. A systematic presentation of financial betrayal that painted a picture of a man who'd been living a double life at his wife's expense. Hotel charges for romantic weekends I'd never taken. Dinner charges for 2 people during times when Bob had told me he was eating alone at the hospital cafeteria. Flowers delivered to addresses I'd never heard of. Mrs. Chen, over the course of your investigation into these charges, what total amount of marital funds do you estimate your husband spent on his relationship with Ms. Parker? Based on charges I can directly trace, approximately $18,000 over 14 months. I heard Bob shift in his chair behind me, but I didn't turn around. $18,000 of community property spent on an extramarital affair? Yes. When Patricia finished her examination, Mr. Henley approached the witness stand with a different energy, less gentle, more aggressive. He was going to try to make me seem like a bitter, vindictive woman who couldn't accept reality. Mrs. Chen, isn't it true that you and your husband had been growing apart for several years before he met Ms. Parker? I wasn't aware that we were growing apart. Come now, Mrs. Chen. A 40-year marriage doesn't end overnight. Surely you must have noticed that the romance had faded? That you and Mr. Williams had become more like roommates than spouses? I thought about that question carefully. Bob had said something similar when he'd handed me the divorce papers, about us growing apart, about wanting excitement instead of routine. I thought we were in the comfortable phase of a long marriage, I said finally. I thought we were partners who'd built something stable together. I didn't realize Bob saw that as a problem to be solved. But you must admit that the passion had gone out of your relationship? I thought we'd evolved past needing passion to validate our partnership. I thought we had something more mature, more lasting. More boring? Patricia objected. Argumentative. Sustained. Mr. Henley tried a different approach. Mrs. Chen, you've presented extensive documentation of credit card charges and financial records. Some might say this level of detailed record-keeping suggests an obsessive need to control your husband's activities. I felt a flash of anger but kept my voice steady. Mr. Henley, I'm a commercial lending supervisor. Detailed record-keeping is my job. When someone applies for a loan at my bank, I review their financial history line by line to assess their creditworthiness. I applied the same professional standards to my personal finances. But surely you understand the difference between professional obligations and personal relationships. Your husband wasn't applying for a loan from you. No, but he was using credit cards that I was responsible for paying. Credit cards that affected my credit score, my financial standing, my future. I had every right to know what those charges were for. And when you discovered charges you couldn't identify, did you ask your husband about them? This was the moment I'd been dreading. The moment when I'd have to admit how naive I'd been, how easily I'd believed Bob's explanations. Yes, I asked. About several charges over the months. And what did he tell you? He said they were work-related expenses. Business dinners, conference materials, client entertainment. And you believed him? Yes. Why? because in 40 years of marriage, I'd never had reason to doubt his word about work expenses. So you trusted your husband? Yes. And now you're asking this court to punish him for that trust? I looked at Mr. Henley, then at Bob, then at Judge Morrison. I'm asking this court to recognize that trust is a two-way obligation in marriage. I trusted my husband with my heart, my future, and my financial security. He violated that trust systematically for over a year. That violation has consequences. Mr. Henley pressed on, trying to make me seem unreasonable for wanting to keep the house, vindictive for refusing to accept his initial settlement offer. He suggested that my refusal to negotiate in good faith had unnecessarily prolonged the proceedings. Mrs. Chen, wouldn't it have been simpler for everyone involved if you'd accepted the original settlement offer rather than dragging this matter through court? Mr. Henley, wouldn't it have been simpler if my husband had been honest about his affair rather than spending over a year lying to my face? When my testimony finally ended, I felt drained, but oddly relieved. I'd told my story honestly, without drama or exaggeration. The evidence spoke for itself. Patricia called David Thompson as our next witness, and I watched him walk to the stand, with the same calm competence he'd shown in my laundry room months ago. He testified about our conversation the morning he'd repaired my washing machine, about my distress at discovering the divorce papers, about my obvious lack of knowledge regarding my legal rights. In your professional opinion, Mr. Thompson, did Mrs. Chen seem to understand her options regarding the marital home? No, ma'am. She seemed to believe she had no choice but to accept whatever terms her husband's attorney had proposed. She talked about the house like it was already gone, like she had no claim to property she'd been paying for 35 years. What did you tell her? I told her she might have more leverage than she realized. I suggested she consult with an attorney before signing anything. Why did you give that advice? David looked thoughtful. I went through a divorce myself, several years ago. I learned that the first offer is rarely the best offer, and that having good legal representation can make a significant difference in the outcome. Mr. Henley's cross-examination of David was brief and ineffective. He tried to suggest that David had no legal expertise and shouldn't have been giving advice about divorce proceedings, but David's testimony had been simple and straightforward. He'd seen a distressed woman being taken advantage of and had suggested she get professional help. Patricia then called our financial expert, a CPA named Rebecca Martinez, who specialized in divorce asset analysis. Rebecca had reviewed all of our financial documentation and prepared a comprehensive report on my contributions to the marital estate. In your professional opinion, Ms. Martinez, what was Mrs. Chen's level of contribution to the financial management of this marriage? Mrs. Chen was essentially the chief financial officer of the household. She managed all banking relationships, handled all bill payments, prepared all tax returns, coordinated all insurance policies, and managed the mortgage on the marital home. Her level of financial involvement was extraordinary. How would you characterize Mr. Williams's financial contributions to the household management? Based on the documentation I reviewed, Mr. Williams provided income through his employment, but participated very little in the actual management of the family finances. Mrs. Chen handled all of the administrative work that allowed them to maintain their lifestyle and build their assets. In cases involving this level of financial contribution disparity, what would you normally recommend for asset division? Given Mrs. Chen's role as the financial manager and the evidence of Mr. Williams using marital funds for extramarital purposes, I would recommend that Mrs. Chen receive a larger portion of the marital assets. The house would be particularly appropriate since she managed the mortgage and handled all property-related expenses. Mr. Henley's cross-examination of Rebecca was more aggressive, but she held her ground professionally. She explained that her analysis was based on standard practices in divorce asset evaluation and that her recommendations were well within normal ranges for cases involving financial misconduct. The morning of the second day, Mr. Henley called Bob to testify. I watched my husband of 40 years walk to the witness stand, thinking about all the times I'd seen him in formal settings over the decades. Hospital award ceremonies, Michael's graduation, our anniversary dinners. He'd always been comfortable in these situations, confident and charming. Today, he looked nervous. Mr. Henley walked Bob through his version of events, the growing apart, that had happened gradually over years. The accidental meeting with Jessica at a hospital training seminar. The friendship that had developed slowly into something more serious. The difficulty of ending a 40-year marriage even when both parties had outgrown it. Mr. Williams, Mrs. Chen has presented evidence of credit card charges she associates with your relationship with Ms. Parker. Can you explain these charges? Some of them were legitimate business expenses that got mixed in with personal spending. Some were gifts or dinners during a time when I was trying to figure out how to end my marriage without hurting Maggie unnecessarily. I never intended to deceive anyone or steal anything. Did you set out to have an affair? No. Jessica and I became friends first. We talked about work, about life. It was refreshing to have conversations that weren't about bills or household maintenance or scheduling. When feelings developed, I tried to resist them, but ultimately I realized I couldn't stay in a marriage that had become more like a business partnership. Why didn't you discuss these feelings with your wife? Because I knew it would hurt her, and I was hoping I could figure out a way to transition out of the marriage without causing unnecessary pain. It was a reasonable explanation, delivered with what sounded like genuine remorse. Bob had always been good at making his position sound rational, even when his actions were hurtful. Then Patricia stood for cross-examination. Mr. Williams, you testified that your marriage had become like a business partnership. Can you explain what you meant by that? We'd fallen into routines. We talked about practical things, but didn't really connect emotionally anymore. And yet, Mrs. Chen was handling all of the actual business aspects of your partnership, wasn't she? The mortgage, the bills, the tax returns, the insurance policies. Yes, but... So, when you say the marriage felt like a business partnership, you mean that you didn't like doing the emotional work, but you were perfectly happy to let Mrs. Chen handle all of the actual business work? Bob hesitated. That's not how I meant it. How did you mean it then? I meant that we weren't connecting as romantic partners anymore. Mr. Williams, when was the last time you planned a romantic evening for your wife? I don't remember specifically. When was the last time you bought her flowers? I'm not sure. When was the last time you took her to dinner at a nice restaurant? It had been a while. Patricia walked to our evidence table and picked up a credit card statement. But you took Ms. Parker to Chez Laurent in February, a restaurant that costs $300 for dinner for two. Did you ever take your wife to Chez Laurent? No. You bought Ms. Parker jewelry from Tiffany & Co. in March. When was the last time you bought jewelry for your wife? I don't remember. You spent over $18,000 on Ms. Parker over 14 months. How much did you spend on romantic gestures for your wife during that same period? Bob was quiet for a long moment. I don't know the exact amount. Would it surprise you to learn that our analysis of your credit card statements shows no charges for flowers, jewelry, or expensive dinners for your wife during the entire time you were courting Ms. Parker? Maybe I wasn't as attentive as I should have been. Maybe. Mr. Williams, you spent more money on one piece of jewelry for Ms. Parker than you spent on your wife's birthday, Christmas, and your 40th wedding anniversary combined. Is that correct? I suppose so. And you funded this courtship of Ms. Parker using credit cards that your wife managed and paid off every month? Yes. So while your wife was handling all of the business aspects of your marriage that you didn't want to deal with, you were using the financial stability she provided to court another woman? I wasn't thinking about it that way. How were you thinking about it? Bob looked defeated. I was thinking about being happy. At your wife's expense? I didn't want to hurt her. But you did hurt her, didn't you? You hurt her financially, emotionally, and legally. And now you want this court to reward you for that behavior by giving you the house she's been paying for while you were spending her money on someone else? Mr. Henley objected, but the damage was done. Bob had admitted to essentially everything we'd accused him of, even if he'd tried to frame it in terms of emotional confusion rather than deliberate deception. The final witness was Jessica Parker herself. Mr. Henley had called her to testify about the legitimacy of her relationship with Bob, to prove that it wasn't just a sordid affair, but a genuine love story that deserved recognition. Jessica was younger than I'd expected, probably closer to 30 than 28, with long blonde hair and the kind of confident bearing that suggested she'd never doubted her right to take what she wanted. She was visibly pregnant, her condition making her seem both vulnerable and defiant. Ms. Parker, how did you meet Mr. Williams? At a hospital training seminar about new equipment protocols. We started talking during a break, and I realized how knowledgeable he was about the technical aspects of medical equipment. We became friends. When did that friendship become something more? Gradually. Bob was going through a difficult time in his marriage. He felt unappreciated, like he was just being taken for granted. We talked about life, about dreams, about what we wanted from the future. Did you know he was married when you began your relationship? Yes, but he told me the marriage had been over emotionally for years. He said he and his wife were more like roommates than spouses. Did you pressure him to leave his wife? No. I told him he needed to be honest about what he wanted, but I never asked him to choose between us. Are you in love with Mr. Williams? Yes. We're building a life together, starting a family. This legal battle has been incredibly stressful during my pregnancy. Patricia's cross-examination of Jessica was surgical in its precision. Ms. Parker, you testified that Mr. Williams told you his marriage was essentially over. Did he tell you he was still living with his wife? Yes, but he said it was just for practical reasons. Did he tell you he was still sleeping in the same bed with his wife? Jessica hesitated. He said they had separate bedrooms. Ms. Parker, Mrs. Chen testified that she and Mr. Williams shared a bedroom until the day he moved out. Were you aware that he was lying to you about that? He told me what I needed to know. Which was what, exactly? That his wife was just a roommate he happened to sleep with? That's not how he put it. How did he put it? He said the physical relationship had ended. But it hadn't, had it? Mrs. Chen has testified that they were intimate as recently as their anniversary weekend, just days before he served her with divorce papers. Did you know about that? Jessica's composure was starting to crack. Bob didn't tell me every detail of his personal life with his wife. But you expected Mrs. Chen to vacate the house she'd been paying for so you could move in? I expected a man who said he loved me to figure out how to build a life with me. Using money his wife had saved? We weren't thinking about money. Really? Because our financial analysis shows that Mr. Williams spent over $18,000 courting you. Money from joint accounts that Mrs. Chen managed. Were you aware that the dinners he took you to, the jewelry he bought you, the hotel rooms where you spent weekends together were all paid for by his wife? I assumed he was using his own money. In a 40-year marriage, there is no his own money, Ms. Parker. There's community property. Property that Mrs. Chen had been managing and protecting while Mr. Williams was spending it on you. By the time Jessica left the witness stand, she looked shaken and much younger than she had when she'd arrived. The confident woman who testified about true love and building a future had been replaced by someone who looked like she was beginning to understand the ethical complexity of her situation. Judge Morrison called for closing arguments, and Patricia stood to deliver what felt like the culmination of months of preparation. Your Honor, This case is fundamentally about accountability. Mrs. Chen spent 40 years building a life with a man who ultimately decided that life wasn't exciting enough for him. That's his right. People grow apart, feelings change, marriages end. But what Mr. Williams doesn't have the right to do is use the financial stability his wife provided to court another woman, then ask the court to reward him for that betrayal. She walked through our evidence one more time, emphasizing my role as the financial architect of our marriage and Bob's systematic violation of his fiduciary duties as a spouse. Mrs. Chen isn't asking for vindictive damages, Your Honor. She's asking for recognition of her contributions and compensation for her losses. The house represents 35 years of mortgage payments she managed, property maintenance she coordinated, and financial responsibility she shouldered. Mr. Williams lived in that house, but Mrs. Chen made it possible for him to live there. Mr. Henley's closing argument focused on the emotional impossibility of Bob's situation and the unfairness of what he called my vindictive demands. Your Honor, Mr. Williams made mistakes. He handled the end of his marriage poorly, and he should have been more careful about financial boundaries during his transition out of the marriage. But Mrs. Chen is asking this court to destroy a man's life because she cannot accept that their marriage had run its course. He argued that my demands were disproportionate to Bob's actions and that the court should focus on equitable distribution rather than punishment. Judge Morrison retired to consider her decision, and Patricia and I sat in the hallway outside the courtroom, both of us emotionally drained from 2 days of testimony and argument. "How do you think it went?" I asked. "I think we presented a very strong case. The financial evidence is overwhelming, and your testimony was compelling. Bob's admission that he used marital funds for his affair while you were managing all the household finances made our point better than any argument I could have made." An hour later, we were called back into the courtroom for Judge Morrison's decision. This has been a complex case involving a long-term marriage, significant marital assets, and serious allegations of financial misconduct, she began. The court has carefully reviewed all evidence and testimony presented by both parties. She outlined the facts as she'd determined them. My role as the financial manager of the household, the extensive documentation of Bob's use of marital funds to support his affair, the pattern of deception that had lasted over a year. While the court recognizes that marriages end and that people are entitled to pursue happiness, they are not entitled to do so by violating their obligations to their spouse. Mr. Williams systematically used community property to support an extramarital relationship while allowing his wife to believe their finances were being used for legitimate purposes. Judge Morrison awarded me the house, 70% of our retirement assets, and increased alimony for 7 years. She also ordered Bob to reimburse the marital estate for the documented affair-related expenses. This division reflects Mrs. Chen's disproportionate contribution to the financial management of the marriage and Mr. Williams' breach of his fiduciary duties as a spouse. The court finds that Mrs. Chen is entitled to the security of the home she has maintained and the recognition of her role in building the marital estate. I sat in stunned silence as Patricia squeezed my hand. We'd won. Not just the house, but vindication for everything I'd endured. The court had recognized that 40 years of financial responsibility and partnership mattered, that trust violated had consequences, that I deserved more than the scraps Bob's lawyer had originally offered. As we left the courtroom, I saw Bob standing with Mr. Henley near the elevator, both of them looking shell-shocked. Bob caught my eye and nodded slightly, not with anger, but with what looked like resignation. He'd wanted adventure. He'd gotten a legal judgment that would affect the rest of his life. 3 weeks after the court decision, I was sitting in my kitchen drinking coffee from a mug that said, "Home Sweet Home," when Patricia called with news that Bob's attorney wanted to discuss the judgment execution. "They're having trouble coming. Up with the reimbursement money for the affair expenses," she told me. Apparently, Jessica's medical bills have been higher than expected, and they're struggling to manage the financial requirements of the judgment. "That's not my problem," I said, and I was surprised by how calm I felt about it. A few months ago, I would have felt guilty about Bob's financial difficulties. Now I understood that he'd created his own situation through his choices. "They're asking if you'd be willing to accept a payment plan for the $18,000 reimbursement." "What kind of payment plan?" "Monthly installments over 2 years. They're claiming it would be less disruptive to their ability to care for the new baby." I looked around my kitchen, at the morning light streaming through windows I'd chosen, in a house I'd fought to keep. "Tell them they have 30 days to pay the full amount, as ordered by the court. If they can't manage that, they can explain to Judge Morrison why they think their convenience should override a legal judgment." Patricia laughed. "I'll pass that along. How are you settling into your new life?" It was a good question. The house felt different now that it was entirely mine. Not just legally, but emotionally. I'd spent the weeks since the trial making small changes that erased the last traces of Bob's presence. I'd repainted the bedroom in colors I'd always preferred but had never chosen because Bob didn't like them. I'd rearranged the living room furniture to create better conversation areas. I'd turned Bob's old home office into a reading room, with a comfortable chair by the window and shelves for the books I'd never had space to display properly. The hardest part had been dealing with Bob's belongings. He'd come to collect his clothes and personal items while I was at work, using a key I'd forgotten he still had. I'd come home to find empty spaces in the closet and missing photographs, like a ghost had moved through the house taking pieces of our shared history. But instead of feeling sad about the empty spaces, I'd felt relieved. The house was finally mine to inhabit completely, without having to consider someone else's preferences or accommodate someone else's needs. Michael had called the day after the judgment to check on me. My son had been quiet throughout the entire divorce process, trying to maintain relationships with both parents while clearly struggling with his father's behavior. "Mom, are you okay?" Dad said the court was pretty hard on him. "The court was fair," I'd told him. "Your father made choices that had consequences. I didn't create those consequences. I just documented them." He seems really stressed about the money situation. "Michael, I understand this is difficult for you, but your father spent over a year lying to me while using our money to build a relationship with another woman. The stress he's feeling now is the result of his own actions." "Isn't I know. I never thought things would get this ugly between you two." "Neither did I, honey. But sometimes ugly is what happens when someone tries to take advantage of people they think won't fight back." That conversation had helped me realize something important. I wasn't responsible for managing other people's feelings about the consequences of their actions. For 40 years, I'd been the one smoothing over difficulties, finding solutions, making everyone else's life easier. I'd been so focused on being helpful that I'd forgotten I was allowed to protect myself. The washing machine that had started this whole journey was still running perfectly, thanks to David Thompson's repair work. Every time I heard it humming in the laundry room, I thought about that morning when he'd listened to my story and suggested I might have more power than I realized. He'd been right about more than just my legal options. I'd discovered a strength I hadn't known I possessed. A month after the judgment, I ran into Jessica at the grocery store. She was visibly near her due date, moving slowly through the produce section with the careful gait of someone carrying a lot of extra weight. For a moment, I considered avoiding her, taking my cart to a different part of the store. But then I realized I had nothing to hide from or be ashamed of. I approached her near the organic vegetables, where she was examining packages of pre-washed salad greens with the intensity of someone trying to make a decision about something much more important than lettuce. "Hello, Jessica." She looked up, startled, and I could see her calculating whether to acknowledge me or pretend she hadn't noticed me. "Margaret." Her voice was cautious, like she was speaking to someone who might bite. "How are you feeling?" You look like you're getting close. 2 weeks, she said, one hand automatically moving to support her lower back. It's been challenging. I could imagine. A new relationship, a baby on the way, a partner who was now financially responsible for supporting 2 households instead of 1. Bob's adventure was probably feeling less exciting and more overwhelming than he'd anticipated. I hope everything goes smoothly with the delivery, I said, and I meant it. Whatever I thought about how this baby had been conceived, the child itself was innocent of its parents' choices. Jessica studied my face, probably looking for sarcasm or hostility. Thank you. That's kind of you. Jessica, can I ask you something? She nodded warily. Do you ever think about what would have happened if Bob had been honest with me from the beginning? If he'd asked for a divorce before starting a relationship with you? She was quiet for a long moment, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. I think about it sometimes. But Bob said you would never have let him go willingly. He said you would have made everything as difficult as possible. I felt a flash of anger, but it was directed at Bob, not at her. Even after everything that had happened, he was still painting me as the obstacle to his happiness, rather than taking responsibility for his own choices. Jessica, I've been married for 40 years. If Bob had come to me and said he was unhappy, that he wanted a divorce, that he'd met someone else, I would have been devastated. But I would have worked with him to end our marriage with dignity. What I couldn't accept was being lied to while he used our money to court another woman. He said you were controlling about money. I managed our finances because Bob said he didn't want to deal with them. For 40 years, I handled every bill, every investment decision, every financial responsibility so he could focus on other things. That's not controlling. That's partnership. Jessica looked uncomfortable, and I realized she was probably hearing a version of our marriage that was very different from what Bob had told her. I should go, she said. I have an appointment. Take care of yourself, Jessica, and congratulations on the baby. As I watched her walk away, I felt something I hadn't expected. Pity. Not for the situation she'd chosen, but for the man she'd chosen. Jessica was about to learn what it felt like to be the woman responsible for managing Bob's life while he decided what he really wanted. She was about to discover that being the exciting woman was a lot easier than being the reliable woman. The court-ordered reimbursement arrived 2 days before the deadline in the form of a cashier's check delivered by certified mail. No note, no explanation, just the money I was owed. I deposited it into my savings account and used part of it to have the house professionally cleaned from top to bottom, removing the last traces of a life I no longer wanted to remember. With the legal battles behind me and my financial security established, I started thinking about what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. At 62, I was too young to simply retire, but I was financially stable enough to consider options I'd never had before. I'd always been interested in financial counseling, helping people understand their options and make better decisions about money. My experience with my own divorce had shown me how many people, especially women, had no idea what their rights were or how to protect themselves financially. I started volunteering at a women's resource center downtown, offering free financial counseling to women going through divorce or domestic violence situations. The work was emotionally challenging but incredibly rewarding. I helped women understand their credit reports, navigate divorce settlements, plan for financial independence. One afternoon, I was working with a woman named Sarah, who reminded me of myself 6 months earlier. She was 55, had been married for 30 years, and her husband had just announced he was leaving her for a younger colleague. She sat in my office with a manila envelope full of papers she didn't understand, looking overwhelmed and defeated. He says I should be grateful he's offering me anything, she told me. His lawyer drew up these papers that give me half the savings and some alimony, but he gets to keep the house and the business. I reviewed her documents carefully, noting several red flags. Sarah, have you been involved in managing the finances for your husband's business? I've been doing his bookkeeping for 20 years. He pays me a small salary, but it's mostly been volunteer work to help the family. So you've been providing professional bookkeeping services that allowed his business to grow? I guess so. I never thought of it that way. Did you help him get loans for the business? Sign any documents? I co-signed the original business loan and 2 equipment financing agreements. My credit score was better than his. I smiled, recognizing the pattern. Another woman who'd been essential to building the assets her husband now wanted to claim as his own. Sarah, I think you need to talk to an attorney before you sign anything. What you're describing sounds like you have a strong claim to business assets, not just marital assets. I can't afford a lawyer. There are attorneys who work on contingency for cases like this. And Sarah, based on what you've told me, I think you have a very strong case. 3 months later, Sarah called to tell me that her attorney had negotiated a settlement that gave her half the business value and the marital home. Her husband's attempt to minimize her contributions had backfired when faced with documentation of her role in building his success. I never would have known I had options if you hadn't explained it to me, she said. I was ready to sign whatever papers he put in front of me. That's what they count on, I told her. They assume we don't know our own worth. The conversation reminded me of David Thompson's visit to my house, how his simple suggestion that I might have more leverage than I realized had changed the entire trajectory of my life. Sometimes the most important help comes from someone who simply believes you deserve better than what you're being offered. As fall turned to winter, I established new routines in my newly solitary life. I joined a book club at the library, started taking watercolor classes on Saturday mornings, and began hosting dinner parties for friends I'd neglected during the chaos of my divorce. The house that had felt too big and empty when Bob first left now felt perfectly sized for the life I was building. One evening in November, I was reading in my new study when the doorbell rang. I opened the front door to find David Thompson standing on my porch, holding a small gift bag. I hope you don't mind me stopping by, he said. I was in the neighborhood and wanted to see how you were doing. Of course not. Come in. Can I offer you some coffee? We sat in my living room, and I told him about the court case, the successful outcome, and my new volunteer work. He listened with the same patient attention he'd shown that morning in my laundry room, nodding at appropriate moments and asking thoughtful questions. I brought you something, he said, handing me the gift bag. Just a small token of congratulations. Inside was a coffee mug with text that read, "She believed she could, so she did." It's perfect, I said, and I meant it. You know, Margaret, what you did took real courage. A lot of people in your situation would have just accepted whatever terms they were offered rather than fight for what they deserved. I had good advice, I said, smiling at him. Someone told me I might have more power than I realized. Sometimes, we all need someone to remind us of our own strength. David had dinner with me that night, and we talked about everything except broken marriages and legal battles. He told me about his work, his grown children who lived in other states, his interest in woodworking. I told him about my watercolor classes, my volunteer work, my plans to maybe travel now that I had the time and resources. As he was leaving, he paused at the front door. Margaret, would you be interested in having dinner sometime? Somewhere other than your living room, I looked at this kind man who'd appeared in my life at exactly the moment I needed to hear that I had options, that I deserved better, that I was worth fighting for. I'd like that very much, I said. 3 months later, I had my first real date in over 40 years. David took me to a small Italian restaurant downtown. Nothing fancy, but warm and comfortable. We talked about books and travel and the satisfaction of fixing things that seemed broken beyond repair. Can I ask you something? David said over dessert. Of course. Do you ever regret fighting for the house? Taking Bob to court instead? Of just accepting his original offer? I thought about the question seriously. The court battle had been emotionally exhausting, expensive, and painful. It had forced me to confront some ugly truths about my marriage and face some difficult realities about trust and betrayal. No, I said finally. I don't regret it at all. Not because I wanted to hurt Bob, but because I needed to prove to myself that I was worth fighting for. For 40 years, I made myself smaller so other people could feel bigger. Going to court wasn't about getting revenge, it was about getting my dignity back. And did you get your dignity back? I smiled, thinking about the house that was now entirely mine, the financial security I'd earned through my own advocacy, the volunteer work that was helping other women discover their own strength. I got something better than my dignity back, I said. I got my power back. A year after the divorce was finalized, I received an unexpected visitor. Michael knocked on my door on a Sunday afternoon, looking nervous and carrying a small wrapped package. "Hi, Mom. Do you have a few minutes to talk?" We sat in my kitchen, and he fidgeted with the package for a few moments before speaking. "I wanted to apologize," he said, "for staying neutral during the divorce, for not supporting you when Dad was treating you so badly. I thought I was being fair to both parents, but I realize now that fair isn't the same as right. Michael, you were in an impossible situation. I never expected you to choose sides, but I should have chosen truth. And the truth was that Dad was wrong, not just about the affair, but about how he treated you, how he tried to minimize what you'd contributed to the marriage, how he expected you to just accept whatever he decided was fair." He handed me the package. "This is for you. I found it when I was helping Dad clean out some storage boxes. Inside was a photo album I'd forgotten existed, filled with pictures from our early years of marriage. Bob and me at our wedding, young and hopeful. Photos of us buying our first house, painting rooms, planting the garden. Pictures of Michael as a baby, toddler, teenager, with both of us beaming proudly at every milestone. Dad was going to throw "I'd away," Michael said. "He said he didn't want reminders of the past, but I thought you should have it." I flipped through the pages, looking at the visual record of a life we'd built together. The woman in these photos looked happy, confident, loved. She had no idea what was coming, no way to prepare for the betrayal that would eventually shatter everything she thought she knew about her life. "Thank you for saving this," I told Michael. "Not because I want to live in the past, but because I want to remember that woman. She deserved better than what she got, and she was stronger than anyone gave her credit for." "Including herself?" "Especially herself." We talked for another hour about the divorce, about forgiveness, about the complexity of loving someone who'd made choices that hurt you. Michael told me that Bob and Jessica's relationship was struggling, that the reality of new parenthood and financial pressure was creating stress they hadn't anticipated. "I'm not saying that to make you feel good about what happened," he said. "I'm saying it because I think Dad is finally understanding what he gave up when he threw away your marriage for something that seemed more exciting. I hope he finds happiness," I said, and I was surprised to realize I meant it. Not because I think he deserves it, but because unhappy people make more unhappy people, and that doesn't help anyone. As Michael was leaving, he hugged me tighter than he had since he was a child. "I'm proud of you, Mom, for fighting for yourself, for building a new life, for not letting what Dad did make you bitter." After he left, I sat with the photo album and thought about the journey from the woman in those pictures to the woman I was now. The younger me would never have believed she could take her husband to court and win. She would never have imagined she could rebuild her life at 62, find new purpose in helping other women, maybe even find love again with someone who appreciated her strength instead of being threatened by it. That evening, I called Patricia to tell her about Michael's visit and his apology. "You know, Margaret," she said, I've handled a lot of divorce cases over the years. Some people come out of the process bitter and broken. Others come out stronger and more confident than they went in. You're definitely in the second category. I had good legal representation, I said. You had more than that. You had courage, and you had a clear sense of your own worth. The legal representation just gave you the tools to express those things. Patricia, can I ask you something? In your professional opinion, do you think Bob really believed he was being fair with his original settlement offer? She was quiet for a moment. I think Bob believed what his lawyer told him to believe, that you would be too overwhelmed or too grateful for any offer to fight back. I think he genuinely thought you would accept whatever terms he proposed because you'd spent 40 years putting his needs ahead of your own. And when I didn't? When you didn't, he realized he'd miscalculated badly. Not just about your legal position, but about who you really are when you're fighting for yourself instead of accommodating everyone else. 2 years after my divorce was finalized, I was featured in a local newspaper article about women who'd started new careers later in life. The article described my transition from bank supervisor to financial counselor and advocate for women going through divorce. Mrs. Chen has helped dozens of women understand their financial rights and navigate complex divorce settlements, the reporter wrote. Her own experience fighting for fair treatment in her divorce has given her unique insight into the challenges facing women who've been financially dependent on their spouses. The article included a photo of me in my office at the Women's Resource Center, surrounded by financial documents and legal resources. I looked confident, purposeful, nothing like the devastated woman who'd sat in her laundry room 18 months earlier wondering how she would survive. David framed the article and hung it in his workshop, next to photos of repair jobs he was particularly proud of. Another successful restoration project, he said, kissing my cheek. We'd been dating for over a year by then, taking things slowly and carefully. Neither of us was interested in rushing into anything, but we enjoyed each other's company and appreciated what we'd both learned about resilience and starting over. Do you think we'll ever get married? I asked him one evening as we sat on my back porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. Do you want to get married? I considered the question seriously. Marriage felt like a big step after everything I'd been through, but it also felt like a choice I was making from strength rather than necessity. I think I do, I said. But I want it to be different this time. I want to be partners who support each other's independence, not people who lose themselves in trying to make someone else happy. That sounds like exactly the kind of marriage worth having, David said. We were married the following spring in my backyard, surrounded by the roses I'd planted decades earlier and tended through all the seasons of my previous marriage. Patricia served as my maid of honor, and Michael walked me down the garden path to where David waited under an arch of flowering vines. The ceremony was small and simple, focused more on our commitment to each other than on impressing anyone else. We wrote our own vows, promising to support each other's dreams, respect each other's independence, and never take each other's contributions for granted. Bob sent a card congratulating us, which surprised me. Inside, he'd written a simple note. Maggie, I'm glad you found someone who appreciates what I was too foolish to value. You deserve happiness. It wasn't an apology exactly, but it was an acknowledgement that felt like closure. The house that had once been the center of a legal battle was now the foundation of a new kind of partnership. David moved in gradually, bringing his tools and his books and his patient presence to spaces that had been empty for too long. We turned the garage into his workshop, where he continued doing appliance repairs for people who couldn't afford to replace things that could still be fixed. I continued my work at the Women's Resource Center, helping women discover their own strength and fight for what they deserved. On quiet evenings, we would sit in our living room reading together, the sound of the perfectly functioning washing machine humming softly in the background. Sometimes I would think about that morning when everything fell apart. when Bob handed me divorce papers and my washing machine finally gave up completely. I'd thought that day was the end of my story. I'd had no idea it was actually the beginning. Years later, when women came to me for help navigating their own divorces, I would tell them about David Thompson's simple observation that broken things sometimes had more fight left in them than anyone expected. I would tell them about Patricia Rodriguez's insistence that quiet strength could be more powerful than loud anger. I would tell them about the importance of keeping good records and never accepting someone else's assessment of what they deserved. But mostly, I would tell them what I wished someone had told me at the beginning: that sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. Sometimes it's simply refusing to disappear, refusing to accept less than your worth, and building something beautiful from the pieces of what was broken. I was Margaret Chen, and I had learned that being underestimated was only a disadvantage if you believed it yourself. Bob had wanted adventure and found chaos. Jessica had wanted excitement and found complications. David had wanted partnership and found exactly that. And I had wanted justice and discovered something even better. I had found myself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.